Voting ballots where you had no choice of candidates. A parliament that didn't have any power. How democratic was the German Democratic Republic? In this video we'll have a look at the political system of East Germany. The GDR was a dictatorship. Something that goes without saying, you would say. But in today's Eastern Germany, many people doubt whether the current German democracy is better than the system in their country a few decades ago. It has to look democratically, but everything must be in our hands. That's what Walter Ulbricht said when he returned to Germany to re-establish the German Communist Party after the Second World War. This sentence can be applied to the whole East German political system. So let's have a look at the political structure of the GDR. But before we continue, I'd like to thank you again for all the support you've given to this channel. A special thanks to those of you who have given your support via a super thanks donation. The East German parliament was called the Volkskammer, the People's Chamber. It had 500 seats. The number of seats for each party in the Volkskammer was predetermined in advance and could not be changed by the elections that took place once every 4 or 5 years. The ballot paper contained a list of candidates made up of members of the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, which had the largest number of seats and absolute control, a group of parties called the bloc parties that nominally were independent but all had to accept the predominance of the SED, and a group of mass organizations that functioned as extensions of the SED, like the FDGB, the Freier Deutscher Gewerkschaftsbund, the umbrella organization for trade unions in the German Democratic Republic, and the FDJ, the Freie Deutsche Jugend, the Free German Youth, the official youth organization of the GDR. All these parties and organizations together were called the Nationale Front. Voting meant that you approved the Nationale Front. The East Germans unofficially called voting Zettelfalten, folding a piece of paper, because that's all they did at the polling station. Admittedly, you were allowed to cross out all the names on the paper so that your vote was counted as a no, but there were hardly any voting booths at the polling station, and you could be sure that state security staff would never be far away, so votes against were not anonymous and could have personal consequences. And what was the job of the Volkskammer? Did it really have the power to make decisions? Not really. The Volkskammer would never vote for anything that had not already been decided higher up the chain by the SED leadership. Why? Because it was laid down in the East German constitution that the SED was the leading party of the country. At the end of the 1980s, it had 2.3 million members in a country with 16.4 million inhabitants. Being a party member had considerable advantages. Not being a member still meant that you were able to become a member of the Volkskammer, but the Volkskammer had only parties that were part of the National Front, which was dominated by the SED. So there was no political independence. In practice, this meant that anyone who didn't conform to the system had no chance of getting into the Volkskammer. The same system as for the Volkskammer applied to the regional assembly elections, Bezirkstagswahlen, and the municipal elections, Kommunalwahlen. There was only one list made up of candidates from the National Front. As if that wasn't enough, the results were also rigged, which became obvious to all in the May 1989 municipal elections. When Egon Krenz announced the results, he knew that they were rigged. 98.85% votes in favor of the Nationale Front. Unfortunately for him, according to GDR law, citizens were allowed to observe the counting of the votes, and on that occasion they got organized and did so. And the results of the observations proved that the reported high percentage was unrealistic. In fact, if Krenz had reported a lower percentage, say 80%, it would have seemed much more realistic and no one would have complained. And the effect of the National Front governing the local councils would have been just the same. So it was an ill-considered action of the GDR rulers, and it had consequences. The news of this blatant electoral fraud became known throughout the country and led to demonstrations, although the state security did their best to intimidate people and suppress the increasingly vociferous populace. This election fraud definitely contributed to the fall of the German Democratic Republic. Back to the Volkskammer. On paper, it elected the members of the Ministerrat, the Council of Ministers, and the Staatsrat, State Council, every 4 or 5 years. The Ministerrat was the executive government body that managed the day-to-day administration of the state. It oversaw the implementation of economic plans, the distribution of resources, and the management of key sectors like education, healthcare, and defense. The Volkskammer also chose the members of the Staatsrat, State Council. The Staatsrat was a collective head of state, largely symbolic and subordinate to the SED's authority. It was designed to emphasize the collective leadership principles of socialism, representing the GDR in international relations and performing ceremonial functions like receiving ambassadors and signing treaties. But in practice, it was just another tool for the SED to consolidate and exercise power. Its 20 to 30 members were also members of the Volkskammer. The Staatsrat was set up to replace the role of the first and only president of the GDR, Wilhelm Pieck, who had died in 1960. Both the Council of Ministers and the State Council were tools of the SED to consolidate and exercise power. The role of the Volkskammer in electing their members was a mere formality. It was the top party organs, in other words the SED's Central Committee and Politburo, which played the key role in selecting candidates for both councils. The primary function of the Central Committee was to direct and oversee the implementation of party policies and ensure the alignment of all state institutions with the goals of the ruling SED. The members of the Central Committee were nominated and elected at the SED party congresses, the Parteitage, which took place every 4 or 5 years. In practice, however, the list of Central Committee candidates was prepared in advance by the existing party leadership, to be precise, by the Politburo and the General Secretary. In theory, the Central Committee, consisting of around 100 to 200 delegates, was the most powerful organ in the years between the party congresses. But in practice, real decision-making was concentrated in the Politburo and the Secretariat of the Central Committee. So now we have come to the top of the pyramid, to the bodies that made the real decisions. The Secretariat of the Central Committee was a small group of members formally chosen by the Central Committee, but effectively it was the Politburo who decided its composition. The Secretariat of the Central Committee was the executive administrative organ of the Central Committee, tasked with implementing its policies. It operated as an administrative arm of the Politburo, with key influence over the implementation of policies. The Politburo was the epicenter of power in the GDR. Its 10 to 20 members were selected by the Central Committee. But I think you can guess that this again was only a formality. Politburo members were nominated, i.e. appointed, by the existing Politburo. The Politburo was the ultimate decision-making body in the GDR, surpassing even the Central Committee and government institutions in authority. It managed and controlled nearly all aspects of state and society and decided on all major political, economic and social policies. The Politburo was responsible for overseeing the centrally planned economy, approving major economic initiatives such as 5-year plans, ensuring that industrial, agricultural and technological development adhere to party policies. It also supervised the Ministry of State Security, commonly known as the Stasi, the National People's Army, the Nationale Volksarmee, and the police. The Politburo members had the privilege of living in the isolated and well-guarded Waldsiedlung, the elite housing estate in the middle of the forest in the north of Berlin, where they had many privileges. More about the Waldsiedlung in this video. And last but not least, at the top you had the General Secretary, or as the role was known from 1953 till 1976, the First Secretary. From 1950 till 1971 that was Walter Ulbricht, and from 1971 till 1989 Erich Honecker, who in October that year was succeeded by Egon Krenz, who only stayed in the position for 7 weeks. The General Secretary was the center of power and leader of the GDR and the SED, and exercised ultimate authority over the direction of party and state policies, which were formulated and approved in Politburo sessions. He also was the leader of the Central Committee, the Zentralkomitee of the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, and normally chaired the State Council as well. On paper, the General Secretary was chosen by the Central Committee at the SED Party Congress, but in reality the decision was made by the Politburo. As long as he was able to handle all potential rivals in the Politburo, he could stay in his position, and that was mostly a long period. Walter Ulbricht, 21 years, and Erich Honecker, 18 years. From a distance, it looks like a democratic system, but if you look closer, you see the dominance of the SED, which had absolute control, and that could overrule all other parties. And even within the SED, it was a small group of men in the Politburo that made the real decisions. And even they could be overridden by the General Secretary. This all resulted in all the lower democratic-looking bodies only having a rubber-stamping role, and the GDR can be justifiably called a dictatorship. Most Eastern European countries had similar structures at that time, copied from the Soviet Union. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, they all had a central committee and a Politburo. In hindsight, it is obvious that the SED system was far from stable and not able to function without strong support from the Soviet Union. Back in June 1953, during the East German uprising, it only was Soviet intervention that kept the GDR in existence. And in 1989, when Gorbachev made clear that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene in the ongoing changes, it marked the end of the East German state. A quick note before you leave. If you like this video, if you like this channel, like and subscribe, or you can show your appreciation using Super Thanks. Thanks, and thanks for watching.